right, Brian, so what have you been reading lately?
I've been reading The Rise of Moralism by ACNA Bishop Allison. I've cracked open The Dawn of Everything by a couple of anthropologists. And I've been kind of slowly audiobooking through the Barchester Towers books by William Trollope.
So the first one, The Rise of the Moralists?
Rise of Moralism, yeah.
Who are the moralists and what is moralism?
The moralists are the late 1600s Anglican divines, the most prominent one being Jeremy Taylor, but in some interesting ways, Richard Baxter, a nonconformist, also doing some similar things in his theology.
Okay, so it's not just a way to describe like the Anglicans versus the Puritans.
No.
It includes kind of conformists as well as nonconformists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's the distinctive for them as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
anyone else? What makes them?
Mm-hmm. The two things that happened were, and they're very historically driven. So just for a sec, the English Civil War is the reason for moralism as we know it. So in the English Civil War, basically, the king wanted to raise taxes without Parliament. Parliament says, no, we want to have a role in this. And so a civil war starts. And, there's a tendency for Anglicans to join with the king and for nonconformists to join with the parliamentary army. And so there's this, and there tends to be these different theologies that are starting to develop. And there's this anxiety in the air at the time. So you have to realize that up until, the 1700s, everyone believed that your religion, God blessed your nation and gave you blessing or curses based on whether you were offering true worship. Everyone believed this. This was Luther, Calvin. This is something that would separate us from pretty much everyone, including the Puritans in America. But and so there was this real anxiety, and so this is why you don't allow for nonconformity. And this is something that in England was true of both the Puritan side and the royalist Episcopal side.
Where they both had a vision of liturgy and ecclesiastical propriety that had to be enforced, or else God's
wrath is coming on you. And it's like, and so what you end up saying on both sides is, well, obviously the Bible says this is the kind of church government we need, or the worship we need, and if you're not doing this, then God's wrath will come upon you. And there's this real fear as you loosen that kind of tight, top to bottom authority on the nation, that people will break out. And of course, when some people do, there's a real fear of antinomianism, and there's an antinomianism that's associated with Protestant doctrine of justification by faith, the idea that we're saved by grace alone without works. Just because
is it the Puritans who are afraid of people being antinomian? Is it the conformists accusing the nonconformists of antinomianism?
They both did, because, and this is the interesting thing, is that a lot of that's where the Baxter is an interesting sort of Puritan version of this, but it was much more prominent in the Anglican side. But both of them looked at the army, the nonconformist army, and they were like, it's full of Baptists, it's full of Presbyterians, it's full of everyone, and people who just believe crazy stuff, because people have always believed crazy stuff in any denomination. And so there's this fear in Baxter that people are basically, and you see this nowadays, turning justification, the idea that your sins are completely forgiven because Jesus did everything for you. And the idea, it goes back to Romans, shall you sin so that grace may abound. The idea that, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to have this great struggle for a moral life. And so the two great, moralists of that age would be maybe Jeremy Taylor, the Anglican divine who wrote a book called Holy Living and Holy Dying, and Richard Baxter's, anything by Richard Baxter. Reformed pastor is maybe one of the most famous, but he's also got a book of ethics, I believe, the Christian Directory, but don't quote me. And so they're both, and this is where things get interesting. They both do kind of two things. They've both got a strong call to holy living and to, and pushing the emphasis in the other direction. And it comes packaged with a modification of justification by faith. So their Arminianism, the idea that you are saved because God foresees you choosing to believe in Jesus. There's this idea that you kind of little e, earn your salvation by choosing God. And then there's this switch in at least Jeremy Taylor, I don't know about Baxter, but to say that God's covenant is gracious, but you still have to maintain your status in the covenant by good deeds. And that's not the Protestant doctrine that Luther, Calvin, and the early Anglicans, the Anglicans of the 1500s and the early 1600s, they would have said, no, your status in the covenant is secured by imputation, by the idea that God looks at Jesus' righteousness and makes it your own completely. And what your works do is they bring you into closer fellowship or push you further away, but you're always God's child, and if you believe. So
these divines are reacting to how people are taking that imputation of being, get out of jail free card, saying, no, your salvation is kind of contingent on works in some way, even if, the works aren't earning your salvation. That's what makes them moralists.
Yes. Yeah. And it's what leads, and this is what's interesting, is that it actually makes them more works focused than Catholics, because Catholics have this careful theology worked out in the Council of Trent of of initial grace, and that initial grace not being earned by anything you do, the grace of baptism, namely. And so Trent is actually much more careful than them. And this is the other big, very important component for both Jeremy Taylor, who wrote, the most influential Anglican, devotional work. Jeremy Taylor is known as the Shakespeare of, divines. And for Baxter, who's, kind of the pastor's pastor of Puritans, there's this interesting shift towards works that you see. And in the Anglican Church, the direction that kind of goes is there's also at the same time not careful theology. There's no systematizers basically behind the scenes that are carefully working this out. And that's partially because of politics, because the Anglicans were kind of cramping down on dissent at this moment. That's not to blame them or say that they're the only ones, or to, it was a fraught time. They didn't have great systematicians. So, for example, Richard Hooker, John Davenant, James Ussher, all of them were systematic theologians who engaged with Trent and who engaged with Cardinal Bellarmine. And so they were very careful, and they have this huge, aren't just throwing out opinions for the sake of being a pastor, is trying to offer the right product to their, people. They're people who are like, well, these are the truths. This is what we conclude to be the truth, and here's how it cashes out for you guys.
I wonder, so is it like 100 years later, and English theologians maybe don't feel a need to justify themselves to continental theologians, and so are they not just competing with them as much, if that makes sense?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. And I think it's, and they're not competing for a lot of different reasons, and they're not competing because of how difficult things are in the Civil War. And, I don't know when this happened, because that also obviously happens with the Puritans. The Puritan doctrine of perseverance, for example, very different than the continental doctrine and understanding of perseverance, which, and that's where I suppose the Puritan side tended to get kind of tied up in knots anecdotally, from what I know, because they do end up being very, they've got a lot of good things, and they maybe keep a better grasp of justification because they hold to justification by faith. But they do also go in this very non-continental understanding of perseverance that is very works-focused. For, it boils down to the kinds of, morbid introspective assurance issues that we see.
So do you see any of those ideas playing out today? I mean, obviously in sort of like vernacular, you're going to get all of that kind of stuff. But sort of theologically, in terms of what people, American evangelicals who are at least supposed to know their stuff, where have we come since then?
So one thing, the point of this is, so the Puritans, obviously, I don't even know why the Puritans' children went apostate, so I'm going to not comment on that. I don't know why so I'm from New England, so I don't know why that went wrong. I've not seen the stories yet. But with the Anglicans, it's a little clearer, because they were involved in a slide And that slide was facilitated by the Civil War, where they were becoming Arminian and they were changing their theology much more rapidly and drastically. And what this did for Anglican spirituality, I think, was it really made, and this is, remember, combined with, it's a state religion, it's an establishment religion,
right.
And it remained an establishment religion, and it still is an establishment religion to this day. There's this sense that religion for them and sacred things are about trying harder and doing your duty, which, that's great in some respects. I mean, you think of, the great sense of duty that the British people have, and they've done obviously great things with their empire and all that stuff. But the problem is that it got disconnected from a rich theology of imputation and from justification, and it ended up, and you remember the Anglican churches where, it's one place where liberalism is creeping into the church. And so Anglicans got, I think, attacked by that much harder, partially because it's just more of an establishment thing, but partially also because they didn't have that rich theology of justification in many places, and they had to deal with just the sense of, religion is doing your duty, it's being attentive to divine things, to holy living, and when you take out imputation from that, you are getting half of the story, basically. In this book, The Rise of Moralism, he argues that there was really a shift from sin as a condition to sin as transgression, and that really does end up kind of fueling these two sides of the same coin, which are, legalism and antinomianism, and you see that today.
So there's these actions that you need to avoid, versus earlier divines emphasizing like sin is the state that we're in, and then variously depending, more perfectionist theologians being, well, we have the Holy Spirit, so we're leaving the state of sin, and then more Puritans being more like, oh, we're still in the state of sin, and we're still kind of just caught in original sin's clutches in some ways, at least in this life.
Yeah.
Thinking,
you really see that.
Thinking for ourselves theologically, how would you, want to work towards parsing that out of, we have this idea of God's judgment of us. We can have hope in the fact that Christ's work is imputed to us, and so in God's wrath and in God's judgment, being covered by the blood and righteousness of His Son, we're kind of protected from destruction in that way. But there's also is the sense of judgment according to personal works and to merit. How would you want to think about parsing that out?
Yeah, I mean, Paul talks about that. He says, you're going to have the foundation, which is Christ, and then you put, either gold or silver on top of that, or stubble, and the final day of judgment is going to be revealing that. And, I mean, the basic thing is to just, the key thing is you just have to have a real strong sense of your sin. And really, what the original Protestants would say is a strong sense of your continuing sin, because the argument between Catholics and Protestants was not about, it wasn't just about faith and works, at least. It was as much about the righteousness that's produced by becoming a Christian. What kind of righteousness is that? And Catholics say, well, it makes you kind of sort of worthy, or at least it makes you kind of, you gain a righteousness that is God can look at and be pleased with. And Protestants say, no, you're always going to have, sin that, given the holiness of God, is never going to be enough. And so what you need is for, God to be covering that. And then what you then do is you have a sense of the love of God. And I would say that's kind of you have to have both of those pieces. You can't, you basically can't divorce things. You need to have a very, very strong sense of sin, or else it's just a cheap gospel. And you need to have a strong sense of God's love, and that God, when He's disciplining you, is doing it out of love. Because if you have either one of those alone, you don't really have the whole package.
Yeah. I think with either way, sort of looking at it from the negative or the positive side of it, it's looking at your life as God communicating to you, and either sort of disciplining you and judging you in certain situations, or being gracious to you and giving you good things. And I think that's an easy thing to overlook when we're thinking of the world as a mechanism or as this big maze or this like thing that we're trying to navigate to think of to remember sort of the personal work of God behind that.
Yeah, and you can't, well, when you see it as a maze, and you say, remembering that God is, God's always speaking to you through that, what kind of thing are you thinking about?
Well, just, life circumstances, right?
Yes.
And thinking of the world and the messages that it contains, some are deceptive and some are disastrous and calamitous if you follow after them and that sort of thing. But amidst all of the signals and sort of like the symbolic structures of the world, that God is really, really sort of communicating to you and listening for that voice. Just like Jesus says, seek and you will find, if anyone has ears to hear. It's like God has a message, and so you need to be patiently waiting for it. And so it's like you see that in the scriptures clearly communicating God's will and intention, and you see that in your life in different ways of like this is or in your spirit, God's inclining something to you in there. So just different aspects. This is interesting.
Do you have, I want to kind of make this concrete because we could take this in any number of directions, but are there sort of situations in your life where you say and look back and go, or even in other people's lives, I don't care what the example is, of just how that looks, of, you are looking for signals, you're looking, like you said, in God's word, but you're also looking in the world for messages from God.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some people are going to, take dreams really seriously. I'd like to think that I put like a dream as sort of like a medium level seriousness, because sometimes it just seems random, but other times it can be really, really significant, and it can be a message about something, or at least indicate importance in some way. It can be, somebody telling you something or reprimanding you in some way, and to take that
we've
seriously.
All had that.
Yeah, and to take that seriously and say, there's this person who's trying to tell me something, and they could have very varying degrees of intentions, but what is God trying to get me to learn from this experience or this interaction? Because it's happening, so it means something. There could be layers of meaning that I'm not getting, but we were meant to understand the meaning of things, right? So even if there's like a lot of like kind of conflicting messages or confusing stuff, there is like a baseline, intelligible pattern behind things that is God speaking to us through.
But we need to hold to the tension, which is to say, there is something that we're meant to see, but we're meant to see it at different times. And when you said earlier, there's this maze that you're in.
Yeah.
The whole point of it is that there's things we're not going to understand until we die.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's the circumstances of life have different rhythms and sort of like varying levels of clarity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to bring it back around to the book then, so would you say that your main takeaway from it was just sort of the historical side of it? Were there any other main takeaways from that?
That was the big one, and it was just useful to understand how Anglicanism works and why just the flavor of it, which actually does connect to some of the other things that I've read in the past that are fiction, and just those kinds of things.
What sort of fiction would you connect?
I would connect it to Barchester Towers and Jane Austen. So Jane Austen in her books, the way she talks about religion, it is very duty centric. It is very much, do you have serious thoughts about things, and there's when someone gets really changes their tone suddenly. You know that you've hit on something that they've got this whole weight behind and all these unstated feels to it. You see this in any religious group. If we, I remember, this is probably a bad example, but I think it gets at something. There's one time in a TV show, I remember I was watching The Cosby Show, and there's just this moment where they all go into the room and Martin Luther King is on the TV, and everyone sort of like...
They have that moment of reverent...
Yes, they do, because it's like, oh yeah, this is something that's more important than whatever's happening right now that's kind of goofy and funny. And when you see Anglicanism, they kind of get quiet when they talk about duty and about death and about the order that you're supposed to follow. And Presbyterians don't really have that. We get that way about our sinful estate. We get that way about justification by faith. We've got different signals that are going.
Sort of, they're like, whoa, you're treading on holy conversational ground here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So with the, old English way, it would be kind of rooted in this, like, national identity and your sort of place in society, and all these sort of things that are often supposed to be kind of kept private and unspoken. Yeah. And that would kind of tie into the stigma towards enthusiasm, right?
Yes.
And unpack that a little bit of and I've noticed this a little bit engaging with like British history and literature, and it seems like American culture is founded on like the rejection
of that.
The rejection of that. So it's like what is going on with the British just kind of like despisal of enthusiasm?
I think that it's partially at least a trauma of the Civil War again. I know that seems like a cop-out, but I do believe that it isn't, because these myths, these national myths, do at least get turned into these kinds of things. And you see this in Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson is writing he's the writer of the dictionary, and I think of him as at least he's the first conservative curmudgeon I've seen, and he talks about royalty. He's also another example of exactly this kind of thing, this kind of Anglican, hushed tones about duty and about religion and sacred things and thinking about death. And when the English Revolution happened, it was a case where basically the nation fell apart and people killed each other a lot. Lots of people got killed. The order was disturbed. You weren't really safe no matter which order you were a part of. And there's this sense, I think, that comes out of that and this is just a hypothesis. I haven't done a lot of deep historical reading on this, but this is an intuition that you're supposed to be in your place in society to support the greater whole, and enthusiasm basically allows private people to have basically anything that they feel can negate the order, and if you let that go too far, you will destroy the social order.
Yeah, so enthusiasm being this sort of like public declaration of your religious values, in opposition to the nation's most likely, what you believe, what you're fervent about, you preaching out in the open air, that sort of thing. Yeah. You having this incredible spiritual experience or whatever. That's all well and good, but the moment that you make it this public thing, this movement that other people have to get on board with, well, that's a threat to the social order. And so there's just like this deeply buried social programming of like, people who start going in that direction are, they might not be communist revolutionaries, but it kind of tingles the same warning bells of like,
It is like us. That's a good analogy, I think, for what's happening for conservatives. If you start talking about reading this or that Marxist writer or taking ideas from Marx, people are like, well, this ended badly, and really, what you're saying ultimately is socialism, and there's I think a good element to that, but you definitely can see the social suspicion, and it's not entirely unjustified. The key thing is that it makes you dismiss some things that you might need to hear. So
I think people have this strong sense a lot of the time of, even if they don't understand all the distinctions, they just get the aroma of this idea or what's being said here is like a threat to my way of life or to my position in the world, and so they either make fun of it or look down on it, just or react negatively to it, gut instinct, without really knowing where it's coming from. But they do have this genuine sense of like, this is of some other kind of social order. And so I think likewise in America you can see maybe kind of the opposite thing where sort of big public enthusiastic spirituality is sort of expected, but it has to be in all of these ways that don't actually challenge people or challenge their place in society.
Well,
they get creeped out.
It's interesting that you say that, because we had the opposite problem even in New England, which I suppose that it'd be interesting to look at, say, the Anglican establishments and see when they basically accepted sort of the American way of doing things, because in, of course, New England, they had the halfway covenant. The halfway covenant is basically when the New England states, so Massachusetts, Connecticut, where I'm from again, they basically were like, well, you have to become a full member and a communicant at our church, you have to have a religious experience, and if you do not have that, well, you can still be, you can be baptized. And if one of your parents has had a religious experience, and so you're kind of half in, but they're still kind of always waiting to see if you'll have this intense emotional religious thing, and you're kind of a second class, you're a second class citizen if you don't have this intense emotional experience. It's an institutionalization or a failed attempt at institutionalizing the spontaneity in a big way.
Yeah.
And that's definitely what's won out, because at this point we've basically, I suppose what we did was we have this history of not letting that be too political, or at least having enough libertarian, space eventually, and that's probably
like move on to the next county or move on.
You can do your thing over there, just don't interfere with other people. Which is, it's hard to maintain that with any kind of consistency without hypocrisy, I guess.
That is sort of the American way of those. Is things get too hot at home, you just move on, right? And that's how we all got here, all of our ancestors, and so it's just keep moving west, and eventually there's no more room, and we're just gonna have to deal with all of this fallout of the English Civil War. 400, 500 years later, we've just kind of delayed dealing with some of those problems, like mitigated the tension by, we'll just keep spreading out. Eventually, we're gonna have to figure out those
go
issues.
one way or another.
What does it mean to be a English speaking Christian? What does it mean to truly reconcile the tensions of like loyalty to your political body and loyalty to your religious body? So circling back around then to the books that you're reading, you're saying you've seen some of this Anglican mindset in Barchester Towers.
Yes.
Please unpack.
So you've actually seen the beginning of this, the TV show from the late 70s, early 80s. So the first chronicle is called The Warden. The second one that I'm in the middle of is called, I think, Barchester Towers proper, and it's part of the Barchester Chronicles. In the first book, the short plot summary is that there's this warden of a hospital. He's basically inherited a bunch of money that he can use for the poor, and he's been running this hospital with this money that was set aside like 100 or 200 years ago.
So like there's like these old dudes, these old kind of like otherwise homeless dudes who basically get to live off of that because they get a little stipend from the hospital, right? Yes,
that's right. And so it's this case where it's this old institution, and it really is a metaphor for the Church of England. And for, it has lots of interesting, it's interesting because the cool thing about this book, if you can read it because, or watch the show, it might be less of a time investment, but I'm really enjoying reading it. And what's cool is he's got that ability to just make the characters all feel very real and unforced. They never feel like there's a caricature, while at the same time he's got this deep sense of conservatism and how conservatism works and how at least at the moment that he's writing in the 1800s.
The author,
William Trollope,
mm-hmm.
Walter Trollope. He's using this sort of institution of this hospital that is, a metaphor for just how conservatism can die, basically.
Anthony Trollope. Yeah.
That's important to get right.
Yeah.
But he can just
how's
seamlessly.
conservatism die?
So basically, one guy looks at this stipend that's been going for a few centuries, and he's like, wait a minute, is anyone actually accountable for this? And he's like, well, what I'll do is I'll tell, and it's funny because the dude, it's so funny the way it works out. The dude who notices this is a Mr. Bold, and Mr. Bold is, interested in the warden's daughter. But he's like, but my duty, I am a servant of the public. I must make sure that there's proper accountability here.
So he kind of represents like the 19th century liberal reformer.
Yes.
Like, England needs to be brought into the modern world. There needs to be, efficiency and...
we can't have this. We can't have... And this is an American impulse, and I definitely feel this all the time. The desire for there to be accountability for these people running our institutions.
Yeah.
It's a democratic impulse to be like, well, someone needs to make sure that... Because, the book makes it very clear that the warden is a virtuous guy, but supposing he was a dude who wanted to, spend it all on parties and, stuff.
Right. We have this instinctual reaction against, like, got this old money that's just sort of been passed down, and it's, like, being given to, assigned to charity or whatever, and then some kind of clever parasite comes in and is getting access to all of those funds, and
that's not non-existent. Like, that's actually... Any society is going to have those kinds of parasites, and it's just unavoidable. And, if you look at the Church of England, it's extremely clear that they had lots of pastors who were basically like this. You have pastors who are, faithful in the Church of England. Everyone acknowledged that. And there were pastors in the Church of England who were just scumbags who just knew a way to, make money without doing a day's work.
Yeah, I was just reading Bunyan with my students, and he's got a little aside in Pilgrim's Progress of those kind of churchmen who are just, they're just there to scoop up all those extra funds. Something to that effect. He was kind of alluding to them. But
yeah. And so what Mr. Bold does is he contacts, of course, as all activists do, the newspapers. Let's give us let's make this a public situation. Mm-hmm. And so he, sets the ball rolling. The press has a field day with it, saying, mean ward and, keeping back funds from the hospital. And then all the old men are like, oh, we could get money from this. And then what happens is that, but then the cool thing about the story is that the warden is, and this is actually a very interesting plot twist. So the warden's son-in-law is like, well, the church needs to fight for its rights. We need to stand up. And it's the most stupid, terrible PR response that you can imagine. It's the typical conservative thing called playing the heel, where you basically are like, well, the church has rights too, and we're going to go and we're going to fight for our rights. And, you're totally looking like a reactionary because you are one. But the cool thing is that the warden feels a sense of, wait a minute, should I be taking this money? It's the principled, and he's like, can I spoil the plot, or do we want to save that kind of?
No, let's spoil it.
Let's spoil it. So basically the warden goes to the lawyer involved and is like, I renounce all rights to the hospital. And the guy's like, you don't need to do that. You're perfectly legally safe. And he's like, no, I must do it. I must be above reproach completely. And so he basically, does it himself. And but it just shows how easy it is to kill a kind of conservative institution in this 19th century setting.
Yeah, all it needs is some bad publicity, and everybody, public opinion turns against it.
Yeah. And it results in the end with, by the end of it, the money does not get sent to the old men. The old men do not collect the money. And they're basically all, I think if I remember right, they're all dead by the end of the book because things get managed so poorly and badly. It's very pessimistic about that and about the ability to do things. And so and Trollope is explicit about this in this book and in the next book, the second book in the series. He basically says, everyone kind of complains about pastors having this, having the good things of life, but he's like, well, why shouldn't they? It's Pauline. It's, we who were, if we sow spiritual things among you, is it too much to ask if we reap physical things among you? Pay, basically. And Trollope is like, lots of people are really, really worried about pastors getting too much money. That's not a big thing that I see. It's like everyone is trying to get money. Is it so bad to have this institution that doesn't work all the time, but, it actually is doing a lot of good because it's not necessarily accountable. It's based on this sense of custom. And obviously that's a tension you have to walk. You can't just say it's all good. You have to be self-conscious about what this is doing.
Yeah.
And saying, and asking, whenever you're dealing with an institution, whatever it is this better than the alternative? And that's a genuine conservatism, not a just sort of reactionary conservatism.
Yeah, it's so easy to look at like the very, likely very common example of just the person who's getting into the pastorate just because it's a cushy job and they get access to the stipend or whatever. But on the flip side, there's these like incredible downstream effects that couldn't really have been planned of having this kind of class of leisurely contemplatives is like a huge part of powering like the British scientific revolution and the just flowering of British learning in the 1700s and 1800s and all this sort of thing. It's just like having that class of guys who just like they were pastors and they were just collecting all this cash, and so they just did science all day.
Yeah.
Or they just pursued their hobbies, or they did writing or whatever. And so it's like, leisure as the basis of culture.
Yeah.
That really got funneled through the church. So, was there actual biblical pastoring going on? Maybe sometimes. But there certainly was a lot of culture happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting, and that again, that goes how this isn't just about the Church of England, although that does raise an interesting question of, like we mentioned this the other night. We were talking about this of, is it useful to have unaccountable institutions or institutions that are not as subject to the ups
Scrutiny.
and downs? Yeah. And being patient with money basically going to places that is not maybe the most efficient way to put it. And that's the interesting thing about establishment in England having a very stable social order versus lack of establishment in America having a kind of difficulties with that. But both there's always difficulties because you can't locate spiritual pastors. Like you can't quantify the spread of the gospel. It's always going to be personal and individual, and so that you have to factor that into it all.
Mm-hmm. So maybe there's just something to giving your nerds tons of money over centuries, and just seeing what happens.
Yeah, right. I do think there's something to that. Obviously, it'd be nice if all the nerds turned it out to be, these guys who were doing weightlifting or going fighting pirates or whatever it was. I mean, that's the kind of the feel of the Elizabethan era. It feels like we gave all our money in the time of Shakespeare to all the dudes that went off to be knights.
Adventurers and world explorers and all that.
But you also can't quantify that. And so you're kind of stuck with, do you have, what we're now kind of dancing around is how do you create a very healthy upper class that will make the nation as a whole be healthy. If you have a healthy upper class, it's going to help the people at the bottom.
Yeah. That's just
inevitable, it seems to me. It seems like you can't. And the reason I say that, just to make the argument explicit, is that if power is asymmetrical in almost every society, in almost every single society that I can think of, the people at the top there's a few people at the top who have exponentially more power than the people at the bottom, and who affect, the lives of the people underneath them. And so if you're going to have, the people who will matter will be the people at the top, and that will determine the fate of people at the bottom. So right now we're in a situation in our culture where the people at the top have almost no sense of reality, and that seems to be hurting the people at the bottom in a lot of ways.
Yeah, or at least officially they're not allowed to.
Right.
Maybe plenty of them have a great sense of reality, but they're just not officially allowed. Yeah, I wonder about that. Like, with meritocracy in America, like, everybody loves to put up, elites or academics or experts and, make them the whipping boy for this or that. And it is good to humble them and humiliate them when they're being so egregious. But,
and when their whole system of education is destroying them. What you mentioned was the expert, and the whole point of, the problem with an expert is that he, sort of picks a very small field, totally cut off from everything else, and gets really good at that. And it's sort of like, it's like elephantiasis. Is that what you call it? Where, your one limb is kind of growing way disproportionate to everything else. That's kind of the way we do our education now.
Yeah, and it's easy to sort of like make fun of those people who get caught sort of like speaking outside their domain or like putting on airs like they're the super smart one, like Neil deGrasse Tyson or something like that. It's like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about most of this stuff. But that being said, eventually, you have to have some people who are better because if everybody's just brought down to average in every respect, it's terrible.
Yeah.
The average person is going to be totally useless in most like specific technical scenarios, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so when it comes to like a lot of cultural problems, like we do want to make fun of elites and we do want to like lift up the common man has this sort of common knowledge and this like sort of casual folk wisdom that the big brain genius expert in all of their study has kind of just brought themselves into deeper forms of stupidity. But really there are just like people who really just are more put together and are more competent and are more high energy. And those people do work their way to the top of these institutions because they have the ambition and they have the intelligence and all that sort of thing. So it's like I don't respect a lot of these people for the weird positions they put themselves in order to get whatever kind of status that they want. But it's hard to deny that like that love of glory that they have does propel them to just be more excellent than the average just Joe Schmo on the street.
It's the irony. Yeah, it's the irony of our moment that we deny and are making it. We're holding to this egalitarian ideal, and there's a sense in which egalitarianism is being socially very destructive right now and is holding back people. But there is this deep sense that at the top of society, hierarchy still holds and still basically functions and works. It's like, it's still there. The people at the top, the best people are getting to the top. Not always in every single way, in every situation, but the people that can win at the top are still winning. Yeah. It still is, men who are in charge of society right now. One more anecdote from Barchester Towers. One of the fun things about it is that some things never change. And so there's another, in the second book, there's an evangelical clergyman who's a total skunk that they introduced. But then there's this other dude called Mr. Arabin. And Mr. Arabin is great because this is the 1800s, 19th century. And at the time, John Henry Newman had begun he began initially was part of the Anglo
Tracts series.
Yes. So he was part of the Anglo-Catholic movement, which was a huge part of maybe the Oxford movement. Yeah, which was this group of people who were like, well, let's pull away from the Reformation. We want to reconnect with our medieval forebears. And you keep going farther and farther and farther down this road, and you're into high liturgy. You're into all this mystical stuff, and of course Newman becomes Catholic. leaves the Church of England. And in the book, Mr. Arabin is like really excited about this. He's really, really into it, and he's, going so far, and he's like a single bachelor dude at Oxford who's, kind of just always into controversy, and it's like it's like he's a reform dude, and it's like, and he is like considering, it's so funny how he describes it. Trollope is basically like, yeah, everything in this person's being was tilting them to become Roman Catholic. But basically, Mr. Arabin decides to go to the seaside and just to consider it, thoughtfully consider it. And he ends up basically at this Anglican parish, and it's really cool. He says basically, he was at this Anglican parish, and he goes and talks to the priest, and the priest just quietly, slowly explains the Anglican principles. And so he convinces him not to become Roman Catholic. It's just so beautiful. Yeah. It's like this kind of personality profile existed in the 1900s.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
absolutely, and we still see it today.
We do.
The young intellectual who's just brooding all the time about certainty and authority, and it's like, should I become Roman Catholic? Yep.
What's your perspective on what motivates that kind of thing? Because I know it motivates me, but I don't know what motivates other people.
So I'd say it's a good question.
Because I'll cop. I'm that kind of personality.
Yeah.
Like I've had experiences like that.
Mm-hmm. Of just questioning,
of wanting to be part of a movement and having that movement sort of be your only identity at the expense of your personal life. Of just dealing with the stuff and the people that are in front of you, and so it's. From my perspective, it's LARPing.
Right. But not with Roman Catholicism specifically, but with other things.
No, it's never been Roman Catholicism, but there were other things like that.
Yeah, I think so. So I think that's a big part of it, right? Is it's what we're seeing is among, young intellectuals specifically, or young college-educated people, right? That we're seeing this trend. Maybe that sort of thing is happening with just random Joes on the street, but that's not the dynamic that we're talking about. We're talking about people who have read too many books. Mm-hmm. They are thinking all of these stinky thoughts, and then they're like, "Oh man, I'm gonna have a crisis," and then they just convert to Roman Catholicism or whatever. Yeah, I think it's. I'm very cynical about it. It's young, kind of educated people whose parents are evangelicals. And who are, don't want to deny Christianity at all, but are deeply disturbed by the culture of evangelicalism, which is totally understandable. I feel that as a young evangelical.
And you grew up in mega churches, so you know exactly the kind of stuff.
This stuff is messed up, and we have, you sort of have like the previous generation of like all of these randos who got saved in the 70s and 80s. And then they went to the mega churches, and this is just like the culture that they built, and that's all they knew.
And they're still able to make it because they've still got the sort of, they had some sort of poverty. I mean, I'm talking about the boomers, the typical boomer guy.
They had the memory of poverty,
right, of spiritual poverty, and that then coming to spiritual richness. But then they don't have as much invested life-wise in terms of cultural richness.
Yeah, they're just they're suburban Americans, and with all of the problems and greatness that comes with that, whether they're Christian or not, suburban American is a very specific breed of human, and so you've got these kids who are growing up in suburban evangelical Christianity, and they sort of have this like coming of age awareness. They leave their parents' household and they realize, well, that was like insane. That was ridiculous. And then they're going to college, and if they're like thoughtful or artsy or intellectual or whatever, then they're starting to learn more about kind of history and the arts and that sort of thing, and they get this perspective shift of suburban American evangelicalism is so gauche. It's déclassé. It's kind of shameful to be associated with. And so they don't want to deny Christ like at all. It's like, but they need a form of Christianity that just doesn't make them feel like they're ugly and stupid. And so they go out seeking a tradition that can offer that. If they go Rome, or like the Pope stuff kind of weirds them out, then they go EO.
Yep.
If the if they're not as kind of like epistemically worried, then they just go Anglican.
Yes.
But I think if they, on top of all of those like aesthetic problems, they also have like deep epistemic problems where they don't trust sort of individual moral certainty, then it's like, I can't be Protestant anymore, right? Because to be Protestant, you have to believe that there's some degree of just like basic intelligibility to the world and individual kind of responsibility for your beliefs, if that makes sense.
Yes, totally.
But either way, so you know, the less that you trust that, the more you need to rely on this kind of tradition or clerisy to like be the official voice of God. But regardless of that, it's fundamentally a cultural and aesthetic problem where they're wrestling with the problem of being vulgar cultureless Americans.
Right.
And they got just enough culture to kind of introduce some bitterness where they realize like, oh, other people actually do have a culture and I don't. And they're very nervous about that, and it's like, okay, I need to find some place that can give me some of that culture, and so so they'll be doing this in other areas of their life, like with their vocation and education and that sort of thing. But when it comes to church, it's like, okay, got to be going to a classier, more traditional, more historic church. You know, we're a historic church, whether it's Orthodox, Roman Catholic, or Anglican. It's all about historicity and the aesthetics of that, and it's also a filtering mechanism so that it puts them around other people who are similarly younger and more intelligent and more ambitious in other ways, and they don't have to deal with the uncouth, stupid or even Trumpist people of their parents' evangelical church. And so that's the narrative as I see it. I see kind of like some parts of that temptation in my life. Yeah. I'm really glad that I came to Moscow, and when I initially came to Moscow, like my phenomenology of that was, coming to Trinity Reformed Church and the singing is so wonderful. Yeah. It's like so much better than the garbage evangelical stuff that I was getting, at my church in high school with the electric guitars and drums or whatever. Now it's just like, choral singing and beautiful old hymns from across church history, and just so beautiful. And pastors are wearing robes, and it's like got this historic liturgy, and there is genuine beauty there. So obviously it's going to have the appeal of that. But that hit home with me so strongly because I had already been yearning for something like that as a teenager, but I didn't know what the alternatives were. And I just happened to land in one that was still very Protestant, but had some of those just beautiful cultural, differentials. And I think for many people, they don't figure that out, or they don't get access to that. So the only way they know how to get access to that is through Roman Catholicism. And that seems to be similar to what it was like from what I've read in the early 1800s, of like there's this huge aesthetic push towards Romanticism and medievalism and all that sort of thing. And so all these literati types all become Roman Catholic, just the way that people on Twitter right now are becoming trad cats in their own kind of ridiculous interpretation of whatever that means to them. So obviously all of that is very cynical. I think there is a genuine problem with American culture. Yeah. And that is what they're trying to remedy, and the boomer evangelicals just don't understand this, and so they're slightly more aware children or slightly more educated children are see that as a high priority for themselves. Counterpoint being a lot of these people just have to deal with the fact that you were born and raised in a goofy, uncool, American family, and you don't have the same history and culture as people who've been going to this awesome, Latin mass, liberal arts society or whatever it is. I'm imagining some sort of fictional kind of trad Cath community where they've been studying Thomas Aquinas for generations, and all having tons of kids, and all pretending as if Vatican II never happened and that sort of thing, and just really, really in touch with the past. Not that actually is how a lot of American Catholics experience things, but that's how the convert wants their experience of Catholicism to be, because it's all, it's not just a LARP. It's this like genuine realization of like, oh, the past really has this beautiful stuff. And what better represents the past than Roman Catholicism? And it's got all of these treasures of the past, all of these relics. It's like I want that as an American. You feel disconnected from that. Like consumer society is just not good enough. Yeah. But of course, being Americans, we remake the Catholic Church into the image of ourselves. Yep. We turn it into a consumer society. You see pictures of guys who are kind of like collecting icons the same way that they would be collecting Funko Pops otherwise, and that's or collecting Star Wars action figures. Yeah. They hadn't become some kind of traditionalist Christian. They'd just be you're a Protestant when you collect Star Wars action figures, and then when you become Eastern Orthodox, you just start collecting icons. But it's the same motivation. Yeah. So that's me being cynical. Yeah,
and I think it's a legitimate, and I think it's actually helpful to lay it out that way and lay it out, because I think you see, because what you do is you didn't just say, oh, it's just because they're sinning or something like that. You're saying, well, there's this actual poverty that's out there, and when people get a little whiff of something a little bit better, they, you lied to me. Sets in, because they haven't actually. First, there's anxiety of some sort involved, almost always, and it's like
class anxiety, totally. Yeah, status anxiety.
Yeah, and that's going to be particularly painful for young people, because you don't know what you're doing in life in general at that age, and a lot of young men don't know what they're doing in life. And what there's what you wish, what you I think that points to is that there's a sort of a substitute going on here, where you are, if we just take the one thing you mentioned, the consumerism, that's actually one of many cases of it being the underlying problem. You see the cheesiness of American consumerism, and so you substitute it for something more high class, but deep down you know that you're still in the consumer boat. You're still on some subtle, deep level, picking and choosing.
Yeah, because you had the ability to choose. And so it just goes back, for me, it just goes back to just like, accept the fact that you're a cheesy American and that you're basically Protestant in most of your worldview. And that America is just built on Protestantism, with all of the great power that comes with that and all of the ridiculousness that comes with that. And don't like sublimate your desire to be a more classy, cultured person with your religious choices. Just choose. There's different factors that go into choosing your church, which is like the most American situation to be in ever. Yeah. But don't choose it on the basis of like, oh, this is what seems cool and classy and more historic. Yeah. Because really that's just a filtering mechanism to get you away from like, poor uncool people or just middle class uncool people who don't have the cultural capital that you're desperately seeking for to give you some sort of distinction in life, to give you some sort of personality or accomplishment.
And to just follow up on that, because we're looking at this, so just to keep picking that example, and I think that you can apply this example to anything else. Consumerism. If the problem is, we've got sort of fake problems that, I'm not distinguished enough, my religion isn't classy enough, my worship isn't classy enough. What you want to actually be dealing with is the real underlying problems, because there is poverty in evangelicalism, and that in some cases you're not going to even be able to really deal with that. But what you can do is, you can basically, deal with yourself. Like, that's the beginning of everything, which is just not being anxious, being not a non-anxious presence, and saying, okay, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, and I can control that the most. And then second, I can, try to help my friends along as much as I can. And then the third, place where I have the least control is what happens in the world. And if you're looking at consumerism, what you need to be doing is not putting, just buying things. You need to make things. You need to find some way to make things with your hands or to produce things and have that. That might even be something that is a little bit, out of your way, not very practical. Mm-hmm. But, being able to do handcrafts might be a better thing than just, buying a bunch of things, learning to make a few things. And obviously that can also become this sort of, parasitic thing, but anything can do that. Yeah. And but what I'm trying to get at is the sense of taking, rather than looking to these identity markers out there, these, like you said, there's this church that's out there and you make this church in your image. Oh, Roman Catholicism is this trad thing where everyone speaks Latin. It's like, well, that's not the real church that actually exists, and that, I'm not Roman Catholic, but if I was a Roman Catholic, I would want to just love the kind of weirdness of the post-Vatican II Roman Catholic Church as it existed, not as I wanted it to exist. Same with, Calvinistic churches. Our Calvinistic churches are full of people who, a friend pointed this out, they actually, there's all sorts of things that Calvinists believe on paper, but then you go and talk to the Calvinists at your church and it's like, oh, you aren't thoughtful at all. You don't have all these ideas worked out, which is fine because the whole thing is, all churches are full of crazy people, full of sinners, and you need to love the people that are actually in front of you and not the kind of church that you wish you had.
Yeah, dude, preach it, man. Moving on then from that kind of discussion, I think I ranted about everything that I wanted to there. Basic idea being just kind of, embrace the cheesiness. American Christianity is like flaming hot Cheetos of Christianity. Just embrace it.
Yeah.
It's bad for you, but it
your
still
father.
has its own.
You need to love your
father.
father.
Exactly. Love your parents and don't, hate on them for, not being the historically aware, super like culturally savvy people that you wish they were to have given you an edge up on, your millennial /Zoomer status games and social media. And embrace the boomer cheese, embrace the cringe, embrace American evangelical weirdness, and just appreciate the strange cultural speciation that can happen to that and through that. Moving on from that, then, so we talked about 2 of the books that you've been reading. Mm-hmm. Let's talk briefly about that other book before we wrap up.
Is that The Dawn of Everything?
Yeah, what's that about?
So I've only read the first few pages, but what I read I really liked. It's a book by a couple of anthropologists, and they basically begin by saying there's kind of 2 myths. There's the myth of Rousseau and there's the myth of Hobbes. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a Enlightenment or maybe Romantic philosopher right before the French Revolution, and famously blamed for all the problems there. And Thomas Hobbes, the 1600s political philosopher, the tutor of Charles II, he said that, so they are kind of 2 basic ways of going to anthropology to find what you want. Hobbes says, basically in a state of nature, in a state where we're a bunch of hunters, we're all fighting each other and killing each other, and isn't it great that we have a nation state? And Jean-Jacques Rousseau is like, au contraire, it's not. It's wonderful, and everywhere now in the state, this nation state is kind of terrible, and wouldn't it be nice to go back to being savages, basically? Mm-hmm. And the book begins by saying this is actually still how anthropology often does function, and you wouldn't think so, but there's a book that I've read that kind of, I think you see at least pieces of it. Well, I won't. So there's a book I read by Jared Diamond called The World Until Yesterday, which, it's it's pretty balanced as I remember, but it goes back and forth, and, you still can tell that this myth of the past, of the hunter-gatherer society or the agricultural society, is just an incredibly powerful myth in our culture. And it's really a way, what you really can tell is it's a way of saying things about our moment now and what it feels like to be human right now, rather than an actual scholarship about the past. And they take aim, and this is really interesting, at a guy called Stephen Pinkerton, I believe, or Stephen Pinker. I forget
Pinker,
which.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you've heard about this guy. So this guy basically wrote a book arguing that, that violence was really bad in the Middle Ages, and then the nation state came along and massively reduced the numbers. And this is actually something that the Roman Catholic writer William Kavanaugh, has taken issue with, and he's tried to argue that it was the nation state brought more violence because it made greater wars.
Yeah. And
there's actually a fight between a blogging war between him and my friend Brad Littlejohn on the internet about this. And so there's a lot of back and forth about,
where did Brad weigh in?
He basically said that the nation state, he says that Pinker's evidence is still impressive, even if obviously biased in lots of ways. And Kavanaugh was like, no, I think that the numbers are pretty even and maybe worse in the case of the nation state. And so there's this, ambivalence about it's basically a way of saying, is the nation state good?
Yeah.
And,
which is another way of saying, is the, Westphalian post-Reformation European social order good?
Right. Yeah. And for Kavanaugh's a Roman Catholic, and so he's got lots invested in saying, no, it's not. And Brad Littlejohn, is a Protestant, and so he's invested in saying, that there's actually some really cool things about this.
Yeah.
And I obviously don't know enough to weigh in on that. But this book, The Dawn of Everything, basically argues that, Pinker's whole method is totally ridiculous. And it says, and they say this, and this is something, I'm sure you've heard this before, you can't quantify happiness. To quote another friend of ours, Yarvin, if you are looking at it as a society and trying to judge whether it's getting better or worse, you have to, it's an aesthetic question. It's a question of values. If we are talking about, did the iPhone, just one random thing, did the iPhone improve society? Well, you have to have some sort of aesthetic sense of what it means to be human and whether that's good or not.
Right. There's so many ways to take a given question of like, is, feudal Christendom a superior state of human affairs, or is, the modern international order, or early modern international order a superior state of affairs? It's like, there's so many categories that you're including in that it's almost a ridiculous question.
Yes, and these authors make that point where they say, if you try to go to the, you're kind of going to the noble savage and making him it's a mirror. You see whatever you want to see in that picture.
Your ideal human, it's ultimately it's protology, right? It's like what is man's nature? And so if we could just strip away civilization and all of the artifice and history, what would be the real thing down there? And would it be something really horrifying and savage, or would it be something like really beautiful and primitive? And I think all of it is just kind of mixed together, but the conceit is you can strip away all of the history and civilization.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you bring up anthropology after talking, about all of this English history, but it seems to me that anthropology is a very sort of it's hard to detach it from the history of the British Empire and from the British university
Impossible.
system.
Yeah,
because it's this idea of we can treat humankind scientifically. We can treat them like a animal species, and we can have a natural history of human beings, and that just requires having a lot of categories put together that is very unique to 19th century and early 20th century kind of the English speaking world. And now all of that is kind of getting slowly picked apart by various sort of decompositional organisms. And what will replace that, I don't know, but I feel both sometimes, like the idea of like the more the less technologically advanced state as more wondrous, right? I think you get this sense sometimes when you look at medieval art or old historical art or their architecture. When I went to the UK a year ago, and just like sitting in a cloister. It's like this, like I travel around the world in order to like experience being in this kind of medieval building. But like imagine what it was like to just like live on these grounds and just like always be around this cloister. It's like it's so magical to me, but that magic was just their day-to-day existence. And so I think especially when you look at old architecture and you wonder at it, or old art, it's like there's something that's been lost, some amazing beauty to existence that has been destroyed. And so that kind of builds up in you this kind of longing for the past, and this idea of the more primitive, or at least the older, and those are two separate things, but at least those things being just more delicious to be in, even if they could be more violent. But then obviously Hobbes, you got to give Hobbes his due. Like it does seem like being a barbarian isn't all it cracks up to be sometimes.
No, and I mean, it's the human condition will always have incredible things wrong with it, and incredibly beautiful, wonderful things about it. Yeah. And we know that without having to go, anywhere almost.
Yeah. So you just started the book, so you'll have to tell me more about it.
I want to share more about this here because it's pretty cool.
Yeah. For sure. Well, any last thoughts, Brian? Tying things together?
Yeah, I've got one final question that I kind of realized. Do you think, maybe this is a topic for another time, but one thing that we see in the book Barchester Towers is that there's been this liberal slide, and it's something about, going public with the, going to the newspapers. Mm-hmm. There's something about the American spirit that is innately at this point, casting off more and more shackles, if that makes sense, and reducing to the worst possible human being. Like, I think we might have alluded to that, but I think it's worth asking, is there something about, and this is an anthropological question, is there something about society that's making it inevitable that we, just go to the lowest common denominator of a sort, which almost always shifts left, or at least to a more libertarian, and maybe not even libertarian. Libertarian's a loaded term.
More anarchic.
More anarchic, more anyone can do what they want to do as a social ethic, which is not necessarily libertarian.
Libertine.
Libertine maybe is a better definition of it, because we've definitely seen that, light speed in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years. But it's always been, there's something about the press, the newspapers, which always, for the last 200 years, it seems, has been always picking the underdog, or at least whoever can pretend to be the underdog. But, do you think that there's something here?
Yeah, I thought about that, and it does, history of media and politics and all of the chicken and egg questions that come with that.
Yeah.
There's this...
complicated.
Yeah. You don't always know what is causing what part of the chain, but you just see them moving together in parallel, which is like more open access to information, more vulgarity in particular respects, like the mode of vulgarity changing, I suppose, because it's like far be it from me to say that any other century of our culture didn't have its vulgarity, right?
Yeah.
It was vulgar all the time, but the way in which like culture kind of like enshrines or looks down upon vulgarity, obviously it's the standards that are changing. So yeah, I think that's deeply tied to media forms. The rise of the newspapers, you see them kind of destroying certain traditions and certain cultural modes that existed in the past. They're sort of this force of chaos and entropy that kind of like breaks those things down into ruins, because the farther and wider and louder that you can spread bad reputation, the harder it is to keep certain institutions intact. Likewise with social media, I think something we're seeing with social media now is it's so easy to tank somebody's reputation. You see this a lot with the entertainment industry, right?
Yeah.
Big creator guy scandal, he was, getting too handsy with some of the female interns, or he was, messaging 17-year-old girls or something like that. It happens like every month. There's like a new guy like that. Yeah. And so, because of the, people are really sensitive to that issue, and it gets instantly broadcast, reputation totally destroyed. Even if, sometimes it seems kind of sketchy, kind of like some of the details aren't all there, and it's just the court of public opinion. So it's very, very much not procedural. It's just kind of is there enough of accumulated stink about this person that we can just kind of slap them down from the public sphere and make sure that they never have any sort of big prestige again. It seems like that those kind of dynamics of what the internet picks as pet issues are going to have long-term, huge behavioral and institutional effects of, the way that men and women relate to each other, whether for the better or for the worse, is now going to have all of this data in the back of their minds about my behavior needs to conform to these internet expectations, or the way that institutions are formed of maybe we shouldn't have this strong, charismatic guy at leading our team because he's unpredictable and he could get canceled super easily because he's kind of wild and out of control, and maybe he's too loose with the ladies. And meanwhile, you have these high energy guys who are the ones who can really make crazy fun entertainment happen. At least by the standards of society. They're being told also, if you do all this and put in all this energy, you shouldn't talk to women while you're doing any of this. So that's going to be a huge incentive for them not to become parts of big media institutions and achieve glory in that way, because it's so regulated and it's so anti-sexual in weird ways. And so it's not like I'm praising the Weinstein types, or the most recently it was Justin Roiland of Rick and Morty. It's I don't care if Justin Roiland gets kicked out of Rick and Morty. He seems like a scummy dude, and it was a scummy show to begin with. But thinking of this as a type pattern of high energy creative dudes who want the spoils of their fame and celebrity, being told, you don't get any spoils of fame and celebrity.
Yes.
Well, they're not going to want to pursue that. And so that leads to all of these downstream secondary effects institutionally and in the industry that maybe that long term seriously degrades the quality of what that industry is producing. Now that's celebrity culture. It's
but it shows how the newspaper works,
right? But it's thinking,
public opinion works.
How much. Obviously, everyone pays more attention to that because it's celebrity culture, but some of those dynamics have to transfer into everywhere else because social media replicates celebrity culture for everything on a small scale. You have these celebrities of. The micro celebrities of any given industry or brand or niche interest or whatever, and you see those kind of similar drama dynamics play out in other niche online communities.
In the nation as a whole, and in our churches and every
absolutely in churches. I seriously think social media is totally going to change how church structures are going to work. How church leadership policies are going to work, and there's obviously this big push against strong charismatic leaders. Instead, you need to have very internet safe and litigation safe kind of bureaucracies, especially ones that are as egalitarian and female led as possible, and that's just what these institutions will do to insulate themselves from criticism. But are there going to be some negative effects of that long stream of not putting forward high powered executive types.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about, there's lots of ways that's been good, I'm sure, where bad things have been stopped. But if you're concerned about, what we might call a liberal slide, what the phenomenon we're talking about right now, which is the use of the press to basically blow up institutions and to take down great men, you need to just be aware that that's a thing, and that's this, like many other things, is an anti-conservative thing, and that it's not always good. And even if you're dealing with something that, looks like it's a good change, beware of how it's changing and what it's doing to your, and what kind of reactivity is going on, and how this could be used against you, because many situations where everyone was fine and everyone was working, suddenly it's now put onto social media or onto the news or onto the newspaper or wherever you have, and you're now in this society of spectacle, which it's not really related to reality in a big way. And if you could just kind of step away from the circle and away from the immediately reactive narratives that are being peddled in the public square, you can maybe make a wiser decision about what's going on.
Yeah.
Because these things are complicated. Like, any of these things, which involves, even if it was something as simple as like, 3 friends. Let's do the most small thing. Supposing I do a Facebook post and there's a huge, bunch of people going back and forth. Well, what hopefully you would do if you had 3 friends that were just trying to figure out how to, do we stay friends over this Facebook post, the most unhelpful thing to do would be to really fixate on the narratives of what this person is doing, how that narrative fits into these other stories. What you want to do is you want to basically sit down, be anti-anxious, be calm, and just see, where's this person coming from, what's actually going on, and get away from the the smoke and mirrors, and get to the what's going on with this person. And that's actually difficult, because you can't even figure out yourself and your own motives. Your own motives are very complex and twisted, and how much more just looking at someone across the table from you and saying, okay, what's motivating this person? Like, that's actually difficult, and requires some humility.
Yeah, having those, keeping your head calm in times of great, drama and scandal and gossip and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think a lot of guys are unprepared for the world of social media. Marshall McLuhan thought of, modern media technology of creating this kind of global village effect. And what do you have when you have a global village? You've got a globe of, women gossiping with each other.
Yeah.
And that's an incredibly powerful tool of destruction, in the sense, for good or for bad, some things do need to be destroyed, right? And so it's like, so much of society is putting trust in this particular individual, this man who has like executive power, and everybody, trusts and builds up the institution around that person, and trusts him to like be the guiding kind of anchor. But when you have these powerful networks of distrust, whether they're being, actually run by women or by men, it just seems to be women are like more motivated and more powerful at using these communication tools. It works to basically break down authority.
Yes.
And so, some authorities...
That's a concern I've had for a long time.
Some authorities need to be broken down, but if you keep doing that, eventually what you get is just like crummy village culture where everybody knows all of the wrongs that have been done to everybody else. Nobody really is capable of building something great because they don't trust the great man enough, because they know all the bad things that he's done, and they don't just band together under him and build the skyscraper.
Right.
Yeah. So for better or for worse, it looks as if we're headed towards matriarchal society.
Yeah. Don't disagree with that.
Hey, I'm just along for the ride.